Hello and welcome to Let's Read The Meek One by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This is an audio recording of the story with introductory and concluding comments from me, the reader. If you want to jump straight to the text, enlarge the video description below and you'll see how to navigate right there. Otherwise, stick with me and I'll offer a few words of introduction. First off, this story is in the public domain. The version we will be reading has been translated by Constance Garnett, and it is included in a Barnes & Noble Classics volume, along with The Double, White Nights, Notes from Underground, and The Dream of a Ridiculous Man, and it comes with an introduction and notes from Deborah Martinson of Columbia University. In this format, it is more than 40 pages long. That length pushes the limits of what we would ordinarily call a short story. In fact, the Meek One has the structure of a novella, dividing into 10 chapters over 2 parts. Nevertheless, it is usually classified as a short story, and that page count is lower than several of Dostoevsky's works that share that designation. In my own judgment, it is best read in either 1 or 2 sittings, and I have decided not to interject with my own comments during the text itself. I will, however, be providing visual comments on the screen, where the text makes references that might be obscure to a general audience, or where dialogue becomes difficult to parse in audio format. The Meek One originally appeared as the November 1876 installment of Diary of a Writer. The diary was a unique periodical, written entirely by Dostoevsky, which opened the seasoned author's mind to the public, and it included a wide range of material: political opinions, reactions to local current events, various reminiscences, and a few short stories. In the October issue, he reported on 2 very different non-fictional cases of suicide, each of which was an inspiration for a work of fiction. One of these was the astonishingly cavalier suicide of Liza Herzen, daughter of famous author Alexander Herzen, which was the stimulus for an unusual article, a fictional suicide note called The Sentence. The other was the death of a poor seamstress who leapt from the 4th floor of a Petersburg building in desperation. In that October article, Dostoevsky describes it as the timid and humble suicide of a meek soul. It is this latter episode that sparked the author's imagination for the current story, which appeared 1 month later. It is not spoiling the story to say that it ends in suicide. Dostoevsky tells us as much in his introductory authorial note, and again on the first page of the story itself. The drama takes place in the mind of the deceased woman's husband. What we get is a kind of stream of consciousness, where the unnamed husband attempts to come to grips with the sequence of events that has led to the present moment, where his dead wife is lying on the table in the other room. The stream of consciousness technique may be common fare for modern readers, but it was uncommon enough at the time that Dostoevsky thought the story deserved to be called fantastic. Typically, his first-person narratives are presented as though taken from the notes or diary of the narrator himself. That familiar strategy is unavailable here, and so Dostoevsky felt the need to explain his own method in his authorial note. The title of the story is sometimes translated as A Gentle Creature, but in the original Russian the title is Krotkaya, which is the term used in the famous beatitude about the meek in the Sermon on the Mount. Martinson also connects the term to a popular literary theory of the time that divided the characters of Russian literature into peaceable and predatory types. The peaceable or meek type is thought to be distinctively Russian, and so in the eyes of Dostoevsky, more admirable and good than the predatory type associated with Western Europe. In the original conception of the story, the Meek One herself was the primary focus. But as the story was written, the husband's psyche took on a greater role. In fact, all 5 stories collected in the Barnes & Noble volume are dominated by male Petersburg loners. The last 4 of them, White Nights, Notes from Underground, The Meek One, and The Dream of a Ridiculous Man, are similar enough that, according to Robert Belknap, they can be imaginatively interpreted as composing a kind of 4-part virtual novel. But the most obvious point of comparison to The Meek One is Notes from Underground in particular, especially Part 2 of that earlier novella. Despite being written a dozen years later, the character of the husband in this story is highly reminiscent of the underground man, as is his way of thinking or speaking, as if to some mysterious audience that he continually addresses as gentlemen. Indeed, Joseph Frank refers to the narrator as, quote, the best rounded and most finely modulated portrait of his underground man character type, unquote. And many critics think of this work as one of Dostoevsky's best short stories. It's about time to discover why. So sit back and enjoy The Meek One. The Meek One. A fantastic story. From the author. I beg my reader's forgiveness that instead of the diary in its usual form, I am only providing a tale. But I was truly occupied with this tale for the greater part of the month. In any case, I beg readers' indulgence. Now, about the story itself. I have titled it fantastic, even though I consider it realistic to the highest degree. But the fantastic is really there, in the story's very form, something I find it necessary to clarify in advance. In fact, it is neither a story nor notes. Imagine to yourself a husband whose wife, a suicide, is lying on a table, having thrown herself out a window several hours earlier. He is agitated and has not yet collected his thoughts. He is walking about his room and trying to make sense of what happened, to collect his thoughts together. Moreover, he is an inveterate hypochondriac, one of those who talk to themselves. So here he is talking to himself, narrating the case, explaining it to himself. Despite the seeming coherence of his speech, he contradicts himself several times, both in logic and in feelings. He justifies himself, and he blames her, and proposes extraneous interpretations. Here is coarseness of thought and of heart. Here is deep feeling. Little by little, he really explains the case to himself and collects his thoughts together. The series of memories he summons irresistibly leads him at last to the truth. The truth irresistibly elevates his mind and heart. Toward the story's end, the tone changes compared with its disordered beginning. The truth is revealed sufficiently clearly and definitively to the unfortunate, at least for himself. That is the subject. Of course, the story's legal trial continues for several hours, with fits and starts, with gaps and in contradictory form. Sometimes he speaks to himself. Sometimes he turns as though to an invisible reader, to some kind of judge. It is always thus in reality. If a stenographer had been able to overhear him and record it all, then it would have come out a bit more rough, a bit less polished than I have represented it. But insofar as it seems to me, the psychological order perhaps would remain the same. The presupposition about a stenographer recording it all, after which I would polish the transcription, is what I call the fantastic in the story. Yet something partly similar has already more than once been allowed in art heretofore. Victor Hugo, for instance, in his masterpiece, The Last Day of a Man Condemned to Death, used almost the same technique. And though he did not introduce a stenographer, he did allow an even greater inverisimilitude, proposing that a condemned man might, and had time, to carry on his notes not only to his final day, but even to his final hour, and literally to his final minute. But without allowing that fantasy, the story would not exist, the most real and most truthful work of all he wrote. Part 1, Chapter 1. Who I Was and Who She Was. Oh, while she is still here, it is still all right. I go up and look at her every minute. But tomorrow they will take her away, and how shall I be left alone? Now she is on the table in the drawing-room. They put 2 card tables together. The coffin will be here tomorrow. White, pure white Gros de Naples. But that's not it. I keep walking and walking, trying to explain it to myself. For the last 6 hours I have been trying to explain, but I still can't collect my thoughts. The fact is, I walk and walk and walk. This is how it was. I will simply tell it in order. Order. Gentlemen, I am far from being a literary man, and you will see that. But no matter, I'll tell it as I understand it myself. The horror of it for me is that I understand it all. It was, if you care to know, that is to take it from the beginning, that she used to come to me simply to pawn things, to pay for advertising in the Voice to the effect that a governess was quite willing to travel, to give lessons at home, and so on and so on. That was at the very beginning, and I, of course, made no difference between her and the others. She comes, I thought, like anyone else, and so on. But afterwards I began to see a difference. She was such a slender, fair little thing, rather tall, always a little awkward with me, as though embarrassed. I fancy she was the same with all strangers, and in her eyes, of course, I was exactly like anybody else, that is, not as a pawnbroker, but as a man. As soon as she received the money, she would turn round at once and go away. And always in silence. Other women argue so, entreat, haggle for me to give them more. This one did not ask for more. I believe I am muddling it up. Yes, I was struck first of all by the things she brought. Poor little silver gilt earrings, a trashy little locket, things not worth 6pence. She knew herself that they were worth next to nothing, but I could see from her face that they were treasures to her, and I found out afterwards as a fact that they were all that was left her belonging to her father and mother. Only once I allowed myself to scoff at her things. You see, I never allow myself to behave like that. I keep up a gentlemanly tone with my clients. Few words, politeness, and sternness. Sternness, sternness, and sternness. But she suddenly ventured to bring her last rag. That is literally the remains of an old hareskin jacket, and I could not resist saying something by way of a joke. My goodness, how she flared up! Her eyes were large, blue, and dreamy, but how they blazed! But she did not drop one word. Picking up her rags, she walked out. It was then for the first time I noticed her particularly, and thought something of the kind about her. That is, something of a particular kind. Yes, I remember another impression. That is, if you will have it, perhaps the chief impression that summed up everything. It was that she was terribly young, so young that she looked just 14. Yet she was within 3 months of 16. I didn't mean that, though. That wasn't what summed it all up. Next day she came again. I found out later that she had been to Dobronovov's and to Moser's with that jacket, but they take nothing but gold and would have nothing to say to it. I once took some stones from her, rubbishy little ones, and, thinking it over afterwards, I wondered, I, too, only lend on gold and silver, yet from her I accepted stones. That was my second thought about her then. That I remember. That time, that is when she came from Moser's, she brought an amber cigar-holder. It was a connoisseur's article, not bad, but again of no value to us, because we only deal in gold. As it was the day after her rebellion, I received her sternly. Sternness with me takes the form of dryness. As I gave her 2 rubles, however, I could not resist saying with a certain irritation, I only do it for you, of course. Moser wouldn't take such a thing. The words "for you" I emphasized particularly, and with a certain implication. I was spiteful. She flared up again when she heard that "for you," but she did not say a word. She did not throw down the money. She took it. That is poverty. But how she flared up! I saw I had stung her. And when she had gone out, I suddenly asked myself whether my triumph over her was worth 2 rubles. I remember I put that question to myself twice over. Was it worth it? Was it worth it? And, laughing, I inwardly answered it in the affirmative. And I felt very much elated. But that was not an evil feeling. I said it with design, with a motive. I wanted to test her, because certain ideas with regard to her had suddenly come into my mind. That was the third thing I thought particularly about her. Well, it was from that time it all began. Of course, I tried at once to find out all her circumstances indirectly, and awaited her coming with a special impatience. I had a presentiment that she would come soon. When she came, I entered into affable conversation with her, speaking with unusual politeness. I have not been badly brought up and have manners. It was then I guessed that she was kind and meek. The kind and meek do not resist long, and though they are by no means very ready to reveal themselves, they do not know how to escape from a conversation. They are niggardly in their answers, but they do answer, and the more readily the longer you go on. Only on your side you must not flag if you want them to talk. I need hardly say that she did not explain anything to me then. About the voice and all that I found out afterwards. She was at that time spending her last farthing on advertising. Haughtily at first, of course. "A governess prepared to travel and will send terms on application." But later on, "Willing to do anything, to teach, to be a companion, to be a housekeeper, to wait on an invalid, plain sewing," and so on, the usual thing. Of course, all this was added to the advertisement a bit at a time, and finally, when she was reduced to despair, it came to, "Without salary in return for board." No, she could not find a situation. I made up my mind then to test her for the last time. I suddenly took up the voice of the day and showed her an advertisement. "A young person, without friends and relations, seeks a situation as a governess to young children, preferably in the family of a middle-aged widower, might be a comfort in the home." Look here how this lady has advertised this morning, and by the evening she will certainly have found a situation. That's the way to advertise. Again she flared up and her eyes blazed. She turned round and went straight out. I was very much pleased, though by that time I felt sure of everything and had no apprehensions. Nobody will take her cigar-holders, I thought. Besides, she has got rid of them all. And so it was. 2 days later she came in again, such a pale little creature, all agitation. I saw that something had happened to her at home, and something really had. I will explain directly what had happened, but now I only want to recall how I did something chic and rose in her opinion. I suddenly decided to do it. The fact is, she was pawning the icon. She had brought herself to pawn it. "Ah, listen. This is the beginning now. I've been in a muddle. You see, I want to recall all this, every detail, every little point. I still want to collect my thoughts together, and I cannot. Instead, there are these little things. It was an icon of the Madonna. A Madonna with the babe, an old-fashioned, homely one. And the setting was silver gilt, worth, 6 rubles, perhaps. I could see the icon was precious to her. She was pawning it whole, not taking it out of the setting. I said to her, "You had better take it out of the setting and take the icon home, for it's not the thing to pawn." "Why, are you forbidden to take them?" "No, it's not that we are forbidden, but you might, perhaps, yourself." "Well, take it out." "I tell you what. I will not take it out, but I'll set it here in the shrine with the other icons," I said on reflection. "Under the little lamp. I always had the lamp burning as soon as the shop was opened. And you simply take 10 rubles. "Don't give me 10 rubles. I only want 5. I shall certainly redeem it." "You don't want 10? The icon's worth it," I added, noticing that her eyes flashed again. She was silent. I brought out 5 rubles. "Don't despise anyone. I've been in such straits myself. And worse, too. And that you see me here in this business is owing to what I've been through in the past." "You're revenging yourself on society?" "Yes," she interrupted suddenly with rather sarcastic mockery, which, however, was to a great extent innocent. That is, it was general, because certainly at that time she did not distinguish me from others, so that she said it almost without malice. "Aha," thought I, "so that's what you're like. You've got character. You belong to the new movement." "You see," I remarked at once, half jestingly, half mysteriously, "I am part of that part of the whole that seeks to do ill but does good." Quickly and with great curiosity, in which, however, there was something very childlike, she looked at me. "Stay, what's that idea? Where does it come from? I've heard it somewhere." "Don't rack your brains. In those words Mephistopheles introduces himself to Faust. Have you read Faust?" Not attentively." "That is, you have not read it at all. You must read it. But I see an ironical look in your face again. Please don't imagine that I've so little taste as to try to use Mephistopheles to commend myself to you and grace the role of pawnbroker. A pawnbroker will still be a pawnbroker. We know." "You're so strange. I didn't mean to say anything of that sort." She meant to say, "I didn't expect to find you were an educated man." But she didn't say it. I knew, though, that she thought that. I had pleased her very much. "You see," I observed, "one may do good in any calling. I'm not speaking of myself, of course. Let us grant that I'm doing nothing but harm, yet—" "Of course one can do good in every position," she said, glancing at me with a rapid, profound look. "Yes, in any position," she added suddenly. Oh, I remember all those moments. And I want to add, too, that when such young creatures, such sweet young creatures, want to say something so clever and profound, they show at once so truthfully and naively in their faces, "Here I am saying something clever and profound now," and that is not from vanity, as it is with anyone like me, but one sees that she appreciates it awfully herself, and believes in it, and thinks a lot of it, and imagines that you think a lot of all that just as she does. Oh, sincerity! It's by that they conquer us. How exquisite it was in her! I remember it. I have forgotten nothing. As soon as she had gone, I made up my mind. That same day I made my last investigations and found out every detail of her position at the moment. Every detail of her past I had learned already from Lucaria, at that time a servant in the family, whom I had bribed a few days before. This position was so awful that I can't understand how she could laugh as she had done that day, and feel interest in the words of Mephistopheles, when she was in such horrible straits. But that's youth. That is just what I thought about her at the time, with pride and joy. For, you know, there's a greatness of soul in it, to be able to say, "Though I am on the edge of the abyss, yet Goethe's grand words are radiant with light." Youth always has some greatness of soul, if it's only a spark, and that distorted. Though it's of her I am speaking, of her alone. And above all, I looked upon her then as mine, and did not doubt of my power. You know, that's a voluptuous idea when you feel no doubt of it. But what is the matter with me? If I go on like this, when shall I put it all together and look at it as a whole? I must make haste, make haste. That is not what matters. Oh, my God! Chapter 2. The Offer of Marriage. The details I learned about her I will tell in one word. Her father and mother were dead. They had died 3 years before, and she had been left with 2 disorderly aunts. though it is saying too little to call them disorderly. One aunt was a widow with a large family, 6 children, one smaller than another, the other a horrid old maid. Both were horrid. Her father was in the service, but only as a copying clerk, and was only a gentleman by courtesy. In fact, everything was in my favor. I came as though from a higher world. I was, anyway, a retired lieutenant of a brilliant regiment, a gentleman by birth, independent and all the rest of it. And as for my pawnbroker's shop, her aunts could only have looked on that with respect. She had been living in slavery at her aunt's for those 3 years, yet she had managed to pass an examination somewhere. She managed to pass it. She wrung the time for it, weighed down as she was by the pitiless burden of daily drudgery. And that proved something in the way of striving for what was higher and better on her part. Why, what made me want to marry her? Never mind me, though, of that later on, as though that mattered. She taught her aunt's children. She made their clothes, and towards the end not only washed the clothes, but with her weak chest even scrubbed the floors. To put it plainly, they used to beat her and taunt her with eating their bread. It ended by their scheming to sell her. Phew, I omit the filthy details. She told me all about it afterwards. All this had been watched for a whole year by a neighbour, a fat shopkeeper, and not a humble one, but the owner of 2 grocers' shops. He had ill-treated 2 wives, and now he was looking for a 3rd, and so he cast his eye on her. She's a quiet one, he thought. She's grown up in poverty, and I am marrying for the sake of my motherless children. He really had children. He began trying to make the match and negotiating with the aunts. He was 50 years old besides. She was aghast with horror. It was then she began coming so often to me to advertise in the Voice. At last she began begging the aunts to give her just a little time to think it over. They granted her that little time, but would not let her have more. They were always at her. "We don't know where to turn to find food for ourselves without an extra mouth to feed." I had found all this out already, and the same day after what had happened in the morning, I made up my mind. That evening the shopkeeper came, bringing with him a pound of sweets from the shop. She was sitting with him, and I called Lucaria out of the kitchen and told her to go and whisper to her that I was at the gate and wanted to say something to her without delay. I felt pleased with myself, and altogether I felt awfully pleased all that day. On the spot, at the gate, in the presence of Lucaria, before she had recovered from her amazement at my sending for her, I informed her that I should look upon it as an honour and happiness, telling her in the next place not to be surprised at the manner of my declaration and at my speaking at the gate, saying that I was a straightforward man and had learned the position of affairs. And I was not lying when I said I was straightforward. Well, hang it all. I did not only speak with propriety, that is, showing I was a man of decent breeding, but I spoke with originality, and that was the chief thing. After all, is there any harm in admitting it? I want to judge myself, and am judging myself. I must speak pro and contra, and I do. I remembered afterwards with enjoyment, though it was stupid, that I frankly declared, without the least embarrassment, that in the first place I was not particularly talented, not particularly intelligent, perhaps not particularly good-natured, rather a cheap egoist, I remember that expression. I thought of it on the way and was pleased with it. And that very probably there was a great deal that was disagreeable in me in other respects. All this was said with a certain sort of pride. We all know how that sort of thing is said. Of course, I had good taste enough not to proceed to enlarge on my virtues after honorably enumerating my defects. Not to say, to make up for that I have this and that and the other. I saw that she was still horribly frightened, but I softened nothing. On the contrary, seeing she was frightened, I purposely exaggerated. I told her straight out that she would have enough to eat, but that fine clothes, theatres, balls, she would have none of, at any rate not till later on, when I had attained my object. This severe tone was a positive delight to me. I added as cursorily as possible that in adopting such a calling, that is, in keeping a pawnbroker's shop, I had only one object, hinting there was a special circumstance. But I really had a right to say so. I really had such an aim, and there really was such a circumstance. Wait a minute, gentlemen. I have always been the first to hate this pawnbroking business, but in reality, though it is absurd to talk about oneself in such mysterious phrases, yet, you know, I was revenging myself on society. I really was. I was. So that her jibe that morning at the idea of my revenging myself was unjust. That is, do you see, if I had said to her straight out in words, "Yes, I am revenging myself on society," she would have laughed as she did that morning, and it would, in fact, have been absurd. But by indirect hints, by dropping mysterious phrases, it appeared that it was possible to work upon her imagination. Besides, I had no fears then. I knew that the fat shopkeeper was anyway more repulsive to her than I was, and that I, standing at the gate, had appeared as a deliverer. I understood that, of course. Oh, what is base a man understands particularly well. But was it base? How can a man judge? Didn't I love her even then? Wait a bit. Of course I didn't breathe a word to her of doing her a benefit. The opposite, oh, quite the opposite. I made out that it was I that would be under an obligation to her, not she to me. Indeed, I said as much. I couldn't resist saying it, and it sounded stupid, perhaps, for I noticed a shade flit across her face. But altogether I won the day completely. Wait a bit. If I am to recall all that vileness, then I will tell of that worst beastliness. As I stood there, what was stirring in my mind was, "You are tall, a good figure, educated, and, speaking without conceit, good-looking." That is what was at work in my mind. I need hardly say that, on the spot, out there at the gate, she said yes. But I ought to add that out there by the gate she thought a long time before she said yes. She pondered for so long that I said to her, "Well?" and could not even refrain from asking it with a certain swagger. "Wait a little. I'm thinking." And her little face was so serious that even then I might have read it. And I was mortified. Can she be choosing between me and the grocer? I thought. No, I did not understand then. I did not understand anything then. I did not understand till today. I remember Lucaria ran after me as I was going away, stopped me on the road, and said breathlessly, "God will reward you, sir, for taking our dear young lady. Only don't speak of that to her. She's proud." Proud, is she? I like proud people, I thought. Proud people are particularly nice when one has no doubt of one's power over them, eh? Oh, base, tactless man! Oh, how pleased I was! You know, when she was standing there at the gate, hesitating whether to say yes to me, and I was wondering at it, you know, she may have had some such thought as this: "If it is to be misery either way, isn't it best to choose the very worst? That is, let the fat grocer beat her to death when he was drunk. Eh? What do you think? Could there have been a thought like that? And indeed, I don't understand it now. I don't understand it at all, even now. I have only just said that she may have had that thought. Of two evils choose the worst. That is the grocer. But which was the worst for her, then? The grocer or I? The grocer or the pawnbroker who quoted Goethe? That's another question. What a question! And even that you don't understand. The answer is lying on the table, and you call it a question. Never mind me, though. It's not a question of me at all. And, by the way, what is there left for me now, whether it's a question of me or whether it is not? That's what I am utterly unable to answer. I had better go to bed. My head aches. Chapter 3. The noblest of men, though I don't believe it myself. I could not sleep. And how should I? There is a pulse throbbing in my head. One longs to master it all that degradation. Oh, the degradation! Oh, what degradation I dragged her out of, then! Of course, she must have realized that. She must have appreciated my action. I was pleased, too, by various thoughts. For instance, the reflection that I was 41 and she was only 16. That fascinated me. That feeling of inequality was very sweet. Was very sweet. I wanted, for instance, to have a wedding à l'anglaise. That is, only the two of us, with just the two necessary witnesses, one of them Lucaria, and from the wedding straight to the train to Moscow. I happened to have business there, by the way, and then a fortnight at the hotel. She opposed it. She would not have it, and I had to visit her aunts and treat them with respect, as though they were relations from whom I was taking her. I gave way, and all befitting respect was paid at the aunts. I even made the creatures a present of 100 roubles each and promised them more. Not telling her anything about it, of course, that I might not make her feel humiliated by the lowness of her surroundings. The aunts were as soft as silk at once. There was a wrangle about the trousseau, too. She had nothing, almost literally, but she did not want to have anything. I succeeded in proving to her, though, that she must have something, and I made up the trousseau, for who would have given her anything? But there, enough of me. I did, however, succeed in communicating some of my ideas to her then, so that she knew them anyway. I was in too great a hurry, perhaps. The best of it was that, from the very beginning, she rushed to meet me with love, greeted me with rapture when I went to see her in the evening, told me in her chatter, the enchanting chatter of innocence, all about her childhood and girlhood, her old home, her father and mother. But I poured cold water upon all that at once. That was my idea. I met her enthusiasm with silence. Friendly silence, of course, but all the same, she could quickly see that we were different, and that I was an enigma. And being an enigma was what I made a point of most of all. Why, it was just for the sake of being an enigma, perhaps, that I have been guilty of all this stupidity. The first thing was sternness. It was with an air of sternness that I took her into my house. In fact, as I went about then feeling satisfied, I framed a complete system. Oh, it came of itself without any effort. And it could not have been otherwise. I was bound to create that system owing to one inevitable fact. Why should I libel myself, indeed? The system was a genuine one. Yes, listen, if you must judge a man, better judge him knowing all about it. Listen. How am I to begin this? For it is very difficult. When you begin to justify yourself, then it is difficult. You see, for instance, young people despise money. I made money of importance at once. I laid special stress on money, and laid such stress on it that she became more and more silent. She opened her eyes wide, listened, gazed, and said nothing. You see, the young are heroic. That is, the good among them are heroic and impulsive, but they have little tolerance. If the least thing is not quite right, they are full of contempt. And I wanted breadth. I wanted to instill breadth into her very heart, to make it part of her inmost feeling, did I not? I'll take a trivial example. How should I explain my pawnbroker's shop to a character like that? Of course, I did not speak of it directly, or it would have appeared that I was apologizing. And I, so to speak, worked it through pride. I almost spoke without words. And I am masterly at speaking without words. All my life I have spoken without words, and I have passed through whole tragedies on my own account without words. Why, I, too, have been unhappy. I was abandoned by everyone, abandoned and forgotten, and no one knew it. And all at once this 16-year-old girl picked up details about me from vulgar people and thought she knew all about me. And meanwhile what was precious remained hidden in this heart. I went on being silent. With her especially I was silent. With her especially, right up to yesterday. Why was I silent? Because I was proud. I wanted her to find out for herself, without my help, and not from the tales of low people. I wanted her to divine of herself what manner of man I was, and to understand me. Taking her into my house, I wanted all her respect. I wanted her to be standing before me in homage for the sake of my sufferings. And I deserved it. Oh, I have always been proud. I always wanted all or nothing. You see, it was just because I am not one who will accept half a happiness, but always wanted all, that I was forced to act like that then. It was as much as to say, see into me for yourself and appreciate me. For you must see that if I had begun explaining myself to her and prompting her, ingratiating myself and asking for her respect, it would have been as good as asking for charity. But why am I talking of that? Stupid Stupid, stupid! I explained to her then, in 2 words, directly, ruthlessly, and I emphasized the fact that it was ruthlessly, that the heroism of youth was charming, but not worth a farthing. Why not? Because it cost them so little, because it is not gained through life. It is, so to say, merely first impressions of existence. But just let us see you at work. Cheap heroism is always easy, and even to sacrifice life is easy too, because it is only a case of hot blood and an overflow of energy, and there is such a longing for what is beautiful. No, take the deed of heroism that is laborious, obscure, without noise or flourish, slandered, in which there is a great deal of sacrifice and not one grain of glory, in which you, a splendid man, are made to look like a scoundrel before everyone, though you might be the most honest man in the world. You try that sort of heroism, and you'll soon give it up. While I have been bearing the burden of that all my life. At first she argued. Oh, how she argued! But afterward she began to be silent. Completely silent, in fact, only opened her eyes wide as she listened. Such big, big eyes, so attentive. And what is more, I suddenly saw a smile, mistrustful, silent, an evil smile. Well, it was with that smile on her face I brought her into my house. It is true that she had nowhere to go. Chapter 4. Plans and Plans. Which of us began it first? Neither. It began of itself from the very first. I have said that with sternness I brought her into the house. From the first step, however, I softened it. Before she was married, it was explained to her that she would have to take pledges and pay out money, and she said nothing at the time. Note that. What is more, she set to work with positive zeal. Well, of course, my lodging, my furniture, all remained as before. My lodging consisted of 2 rooms, a large room from which the shop was partitioned off, and a second one, also large, our living room and bedroom. My furniture is scanty. Even her aunts had better things. My shrine of icons with the lamp was in the outer room where the shop is. In the inner room, my bookcase with a few books, and a trunk of which I keep the key. Of course, there is the bed, table, and chairs. Before she was married, I told her that 1 ruble a day, and not more, was to be spent on our board. That is, on food for me, her, and Lucaria, whom I had enticed to come to us. I must have 30,000 in 3 years. Said I, and we can't save the money if we spend more. She fell in with this, but I raised the sum by 30 kopecks a day. It was the same with the theatre. I told her before marriage that she would not go to the theatre, and yet I decided once a month to go to the theatre, and in a decent way, to the stalls. We went together. We went 3 times and saw The Hunt After Happiness and Singing Birds, I believe. Oh, what does it matter? We went in silence, and in silence we returned. Why, from the very beginning did we take to being silent? From the very first, you know, we had no quarrels, but always the same silence. She was always, I remember, watching me stealthily in those days. As soon as I noticed it, I became more silent than before. It is true that it was I insisted on the silence, not she. On her part, there were one or two outbursts. She rushed to embrace me. But as these outbursts were hysterical, painful, and I wanted secure happiness with respect from her, I received them coldly. And indeed, I was right. Each time the outburst was followed next day by a quarrel. Though, again, there were no quarrels, but there was a silence, and on her side a more and more defiant air. Rebellion and independence, that's what it was, only she didn't know how to show it. Yes, that meek face was becoming more and more defiant. Would you believe it? I was becoming revolting to her. I learned that. And there could be no doubt that she was moved to frenzy at times. Think, for instance, of her beginning to sniff at our poverty, after her coming from such sordidness and destitution, from scrubbing the floors. You see, there was no poverty. There was frugality, but there was abundance of what was necessary, of linen, for instance, and the greatest cleanliness. I always used to dream that cleanliness in a husband attracts a wife. It was not our poverty she was scornful of, but my supposed miserliness in the housekeeping. He has his objects, she seemed to say. He is showing his strength of will. She suddenly refused to go to the theatre. And more often an ironical look. And I was more silent, more and more silent. I could not begin justifying myself, could I? What was at the bottom of all this was the pawnbroking business. Allow me, I knew that a woman, above all at 16, must be in complete subordination to a man. Women have no originality. That is an axiom. Even now, for me it is an axiom. What does it prove that she is lying there in the outer room? Truth is truth, and even Mill is no use against it. And a woman who loves, idealizes even the vices, even the villainies of the man she loves. He would not himself even succeed in finding such justification for his villainies as she will find for him. That is generous, but not original. It is the lack of originality alone that has been the ruin of woman. And I repeat, what is the use of your pointing to that table? Why, what is there original in her being on that table? Listen. I was convinced of her love at that time. Why, she used to throw herself on my neck in those days. She loved me. That is, more accurately, she wanted to love. Yes, that's just what it was. She wanted to love. She was trying to love. And the point was that in this case there were no villainies for which she had to find justification. You will say, I'm a pawnbroker, and everyone says the same. But what if I am a pawnbroker? It follows that there must be reasons, since the most generous of men had become a pawnbroker. You see, gentlemen, there are ideas. That is, if one expresses some ideas, utters them in words, the effect is very stupid. The effect is to make one ashamed. For what reason? For no reason. Because we are all wretched creatures and cannot hear the truth, or I do not know why. I said just now, the most generous of men. That is absurd, and yet that is how it was. It's the truth that is the absolute truth. Yes, I had the right to want to make myself secure and open that pawnbroker's shop. You have rejected me, you people, I mean. You have cast me out with contemptuous silence. My passionate yearning towards you have met with insult all my life. Now I have the right to put up a wall against you, to save up that 30,000 rubles and end my life somewhere in the Crimea, on the south coast, among the mountains and vineyards, on my own estate bought with that 30,000, and above everything, far away from you all, living without malice against you, with an ideal in my soul, with a beloved woman at my heart, and a family if God sends one, and helping the inhabitants all around. Of course, it is quite right that I say this to myself now, but what could have been more stupid than describing all that aloud to her? That was the cause of my proud silence. That's why we sat in silence. For what could she have understood? 16 years old, the earliest youth. Yes, what could she have understood of my justification, of my sufferings? Undeviating straightness, ignorance of life, the cheap convictions of youth, the hen-like blindness of those noble hearts. And what stood for most was the pawnbroker's shop, and enough. And was I a villain in the pawnbroker's shop? Did not she see how I acted? Did I extort too much? Oh, how awful is truth on earth! That exquisite creature, that Meek One, that heaven. She was a tyrant. She was the insufferable tyrant and torture of my soul. I should be unfair to myself if I didn't say so. You imagine that I didn't love her. Who can say that I did not love her? Do you see, it was a case of irony, the malignant irony of fate and nature. We were under a curse. The life of men in general is under a curse. Mine in particular. Of course I understand now that I made some mistake. Something went wrong. Everything was clear. My plan was clear as daylight. Austere and proud, asking for no moral comfort, but suffering in silence. And that was how it was. I was not lying. I was not lying. She will see for herself later on that it was heroic, only that she had not known how to see it. And when some day she divines it, she will prize me 10 times more and will abase herself in the dust and fold her hands in homage. That was my plan. But I forgot something or lost sight of it. There was something I failed to manage. But enough, enough! And whose forgiveness am I to ask now? What is done. Be bolder, man, and have some pride. It is not your fault. Well, I will tell the truth. I am not afraid to face the truth. It was her fault. Her fault. Chapter 5. The Meek One rebels. Quarrels began from her suddenly beginning to pay out loans on her own account, to price things above their worth, and even on 2 occasions she deigned to enter into a dispute about it with me. I did not agree. But then the captain's widow turned up. This old widow brought a medallion, a present from her dead husband, a souvenir, of course. I lent her 30 rubles on it. She fell to complaining, begged me to keep the thing for her. Of course we do keep things. Well, in short, she came again to exchange it for a bracelet that was not worth 8 rubles. I, of course, refused. She must have guessed something from my wife's eyes. Anyway, she came again when I was not there, and my wife changed it for the medallion. Discovering it the same day, I spoke mildly, but firmly and reasonably. She was sitting on the bed, looking at the ground and tapping with her right foot on the carpet. Her characteristic movement. There was an ugly smile on her lips. Then, without raising my voice in the least, I explained calmly that the money was mine, that I had a right to look at life with my own eyes, and that when I had offered to take her into my house, I had hidden nothing from her. She suddenly leapt up, suddenly began shaking all over, and what do you think? She suddenly stamped her foot at me. It was a wild animal. It was a frenzy. It was the frenzy of a wild animal. I was petrified with astonishment. I had never expected such an outburst. But I did not lose my head. I made no movement even, and again, in the same calm voice, I announced plainly that from that time forth I should deprive her of the part she took in my work. She laughed in my face and walked out of the house. The fact is, she had not the right to walk out of the house. Nowhere without me. Such was the agreement before she was married. In the evening she returned. I did not utter a word. The next day, too, she went out in the morning, and the day after again. I shut the shop and went off to her aunt's. I had cut off all relations with them from the time of the wedding. I would not have them to see me, and I would not go to see them. But it turned out that she had not been with them. They listened to me with curiosity and laughed in my face. "It serves you right," they said. But I expected their laughter. At that point, then, I bought over the younger aunt, the unmarried one, for 100 rubles, giving her 25 in advance. 2 days later she came to me. "There's an officer called Efimovitch mixed up in this," she said. "A lieutenant who was a comrade of yours in the regiment." I was greatly amazed. That Efimovitch had done me more harm than anyone in the regiment, and about a month ago, being a shameless fellow, he once or twice came into the shop with the pretense of pawning something, and, I remember, began laughing with my wife. I went up at the time and told him not to dare to come to me, recalling our relations, but there was no thought of anything in my head. I simply thought that he was insolent. Now the aunt suddenly informed me that she had already appointed to see him, and that the whole business had been arranged by a former friend of the aunt's, the widow of a colonel called Yulia Samsonovna. "It's to her," she said, "your wife goes now." I will cut the story short. The business cost me 300 rubles, but in a couple of days it had been arranged that I should stand in an adjoining room, behind closed doors, and listened to the first rendezvous between my wife and Efimovitch, tete-a-tete. Meanwhile, the evening before, a scene, brief but very memorable for me, took place between us. She returned towards evening, sat down on the bed, looked at me sarcastically, and tapped on the carpet with her foot. Looking at her, the idea suddenly came into my mind that for the whole of the last month, or rather the last fortnight, her character had not been her own. One might even say that it had been the opposite of her own. She had suddenly shown herself a mutinous, aggressive creature. I cannot say shameless, but regardless of decorum and eager for trouble. She went out of her way to stir up trouble. Her meekness hindered her, though. When a girl like that rebels, however outrageously she may behave, one can always see that she is forcing herself to do it, that she is driving herself to do it, and that it is impossible for her to master and overcome her own modesty and shamefacedness. That is why such people go such lengths at times, so that one can hardly believe one's eyes. One who is accustomed to depravity, on the contrary, always softens things, acts more disgustingly, but with a show of decorum and seemliness by which she claims to be superior to you. "Is it true that you were turned out of the regiment because you were afraid to fight a duel?" she asked suddenly, apropos of nothing, and her eyes flashed. "It is true that by the sentence of the officers I was asked to give up my commission, though as a fact I had sent in my papers before that." "You were turned out as a coward?" "Yes, they sentenced me as a coward. But I refused to fight a duel, not from cowardice, but because I would not submit to their tyrannical decision and send a challenge when I did not consider myself insulted. You know," I could not refrain from adding, "that to resist such tyranny and to accept the consequences meant showing far more manliness than fighting any kind of duel." I could not resist it. I dropped the phrase, as it were, in self-defense, and that was all she wanted, this fresh humiliation for me. She laughed maliciously. "And is it true that for 3 years afterwards you wandered about the streets of Petersburg like a tramp, begging for coppers and spending your nights in billiard-rooms?" "I even spent the night in Vyazemsky's house in the Haymarket." "Yes, it is true. There was much disgrace and degradation in my life after I left the regiment, but not moral degradation, because even at the time I hated what I did more than anyone. It was only the degradation of my will and my mind, and it was only caused by the desperateness of my position. But that is over." "Oh, now you are a personage, a financier." A hint at the pawnbroker's shop. But by then I had succeeded in recovering my mastery of myself. I saw that she was thirsting for explanations that would be humiliating to me, and I did not give them. A customer rang the bell very opportunely, and I went out into the shop. An hour later, when she was dressed to go out, she stood still, facing me, and said, "You didn't tell me anything about that, though, before our marriage?" I made no answer, and she went away. And so next day I was standing in that room, the other side of the door, listening to hear how my fate was being decided, and in my pocket I had a revolver. She was dressed better than usual and sitting at the table, and Efimovitch was showing off before her. And after all, it turned out exactly, I say it to my credit, as I had foreseen and had assumed it would, though I was not conscious of having foreseen and assumed it. I do not know whether I express myself intelligibly. This is what happened. I listened for a whole hour. For a whole hour I was present at a duel between a noble, lofty woman and a worldly, corrupt, dense man with a crawling soul. And how, I wondered with amazement, how could that naive, meek, silent girl have come to know all that? The wittiest author of a society comedy could not have created such a scene of mockery, of naive laughter, and of the holy contempt of virtue for vice. And how brilliant her sayings, her little phrases were! What wit there was in her rapid answers, what truths in her condemnation! And at the same time what almost girlish simplicity! She laughed in his face at his declarations of love, at his gestures, at his proposals. Coming coarsely to the point at once, and not expecting to meet with opposition, he was utterly nonplussed. At first I might have imagined that it was simply coquetry on her part, the coquetry of a witty though depraved creature to enhance her own value. But no, the truth shone out like the sun, and to doubt was impossible. It was only an exaggerated and impulsive hatred for me that had led her, in her inexperience, to arrange this interview. But when it came off, her eyes were opened at once. She was simply in desperate haste to mortify me, come what might. But though she had brought herself to do something so low, she could not endure unseemliness. And could she, so pure and sinless, with an ideal in her heart, have been seduced by Efimovitch or any worthless snob? On the contrary, she was only moved to laughter by him. All her goodness rose up from her soul, and her indignation roused her to sarcasm. I repeat, the buffoon was completely nonplussed at last, and sat frowning, scarcely answering, so much so that I began to be afraid that he might dare to insult her from a mean desire for revenge. And I repeat again, to my credit, I listened to that scene almost without surprise. I met, as it were, nothing but what I knew well. I had gone, as it were, on purpose to meet it, believing not a word of it, not a word said against her, though I did take the revolver in my pocket. That is the truth. And could I have imagined her different? For what did I love her? For what did I prize her? For what had I married her? Oh, of course, I was quite convinced of her hate for me, but at the same time I was quite convinced of her sinlessness. I suddenly cut short the scene by opening the door. Efimovitch leapt up. I took her by the hand and suggested she should go home with me. Efimovitch recovered himself and suddenly burst into loud peals of laughter. "Oh, to sacred conjugal rights I offer no opposition. Take her away, take her away. And you know," he shouted after me, "though no decent man could fight you, yet from respect to your lady I am at your service, if you are ready to risk yourself." "Do you hear?" I said, stopping her for a second in the doorway. After which not a word was said all the way home. I led her by the arm, and she did not resist. On the contrary, she was greatly impressed, and this lasted after she got home. On reaching home, she sat down in a chair and fixed her eyes upon me. She was extremely pale. Though her lips were compressed ironically, yet she looked at me with solemn and austere defiance, and seemed convinced in earnest for the first minute that I should kill her with the revolver. But I took the revolver from my pocket without a word and laid it on the table. She looked at me and at the revolver. Note that the revolver was already an object familiar to her. I had kept one loaded ever since I opened the shop. I made up my mind when I set up the shop that I would not keep a huge dog or a strong manservant, as Moser does, for instance. My cook opens the doors to my visitors. But in our trade it is impossible to be without means of self-defense in case of emergency, and I kept a loaded revolver. In early days, when first she was living in my house, she took great interest in that revolver, and asked questions about it, and I even explained its construction and working. I even persuaded her once to fire at a target. Note all that. Taking no notice of her frightened eyes, I lay down on the bed, half undressed. I felt very much exhausted. It was by then about 11 o'clock. She went on sitting in the same place, not stirring, for another hour. Then she put out the candle, and she, too, without undressing, lay down on the sofa near the wall. For the first time she did not sleep with me. Note that, too. Chapter 6. A Terrible Reminiscence. Now for a terrible reminiscence. I woke up, I believe, before 8 o'clock, and it was very nearly broad daylight. I woke up completely to full consciousness and opened my eyes. She was standing at the table, holding the revolver in her hand. She did not see that I had woken up and was looking at her. And suddenly I saw that she had begun moving towards me with the revolver in her hand. I quickly closed my eyes and pretended to be still asleep. She came up to the bed and stood over me. I heard everything. Though a dead silence had fallen, I heard that silence. All at once there was a convulsive movement, and, irresistibly, against my will, I suddenly opened my eyes. She was looking straight at me, straight into my eyes, and the revolver was at my temple. Our eyes met. But we looked at each other for no more than a moment. With an effort I shut my eyes again, and at the same instant I resolved that I would not stir and would not open my eyes, whatever might be awaiting me. It does sometimes happen that people who are sound asleep suddenly open their eyes, even raise their heads for a second and look about the room. Then, a moment later, they lay their heads again on the pillow, unconscious, and fall asleep without understanding anything. When meeting her eyes and feeling the revolver on my forehead, I closed my eyes and remained motionless, as though in a deep sleep. She certainly might have supposed that I really was asleep, and that I had seen nothing, especially as it was utterly improbable that, after seeing what I had seen, I should shut my eyes again at such a moment. Yes, it was improbable. But she might guess the truth all the same. That thought flashed upon my mind at once, all at the same instant. Oh, what a whirl of thoughts and sensations rushed into my mind in less than a minute. Hurrah for the electric speed of thought! In that case, so I felt, if she guessed the truth and knew that I was awake, I should crush her by my readiness to accept death, and her hand might tremble. Her determination might be shaken by a new, overwhelming impression. They say that people standing on a height have an impulse to throw themselves down. I imagine that many suicides and murders have been committed simply because the revolver has been in the hand. It is like a precipice, with an incline of an angle of 45 degrees, down which you cannot help sliding, and something impels you irresistibly to pull the trigger. But the knowledge that I had seen, that I knew it all, and was waiting for death at her hands without a word, might hold her back on the incline. The stillness was prolonged, and all at once I felt on my temple, on my hair, the cold contact of iron. You will ask, did I confidently expect to escape? I will answer you as God is my judge. I had no hope of it, except one chance in 100. Why did I accept death? But I will ask, what use was life to me after that revolver had been raised against me by the being I adored? Besides, I knew with the whole strength of my being that there was a struggle going on between us, a fearful duel for life and death, the duel fought by the coward of yesterday, rejected by his comrades for cowardice. I knew that, and she knew it, if only she guessed the truth that I was not asleep. Perhaps that was not so. Perhaps I did not think that then, but yet it must have been so, even without conscious thought, because I've done nothing but think of it every hour of my life since. But you will ask me again, why did you not save her from such wickedness? Oh, I've asked myself that question 1,000 times since, every time that, with a shiver down my back, I recalled that second. But at that moment my soul was plunged in dark despair. I was lost. I myself was lost. How could I save anyone? And how do you know whether I wanted to save anyone then? How can one tell what I could be feeling then? My mind was in a ferment, though. The seconds passed. She still stood over me. And suddenly I shuddered with hope. I quickly opened my eyes. She was no longer in the room. I got out of bed. I had conquered, and she was conquered forever. I went to the samovar. We always had the samovar brought into the outer room, and she always poured out the tea. I sat down at the table without a word and took a glass of tea from her. 5 minutes later I looked at her. She was fearfully pale, even paler than the day before, and she looked at me. And suddenly, seeing that I was looking at her, she gave a pale smile with her pale lips, with a timid question in her eyes. So she still doubts and is asking herself, does he know or doesn't he know? Did he see or didn't he? I turned my eyes away indifferently. After tea I closed the shop, went to the market and bought an iron bedstead and a screen. Returning home, I directed that the bed should be put in the front room and shut off with a screen. It was a bed for her, but I did not say a word to her. She understood without words, through that bedstead, that I had seen and knew all, and that all doubt was over. At night I left the revolver on the table, as I always did. At night she got into her new bed without a word. Our marriage bond was broken. She was conquered but not forgiven. At night she began to be delirious, and in the morning she had brain fever. She was in bed for 6 weeks. Part 2, Chapter 1. The Dream of Pride. Lucaria has just announced that she can't go on living here, and that she is going away as soon as her lady is buried. I knelt down and prayed for 5 minutes. I wanted to pray for an hour, but I keep thinking, and always sick thoughts, and my head aches. What is the use of praying? It's only a sin. It is strange, too, that I am not sleepy. In too great sorrow, after the first outbursts, one is always sleepy. Men condemned to death, they say, sleep very soundly on the last night. And so it must be. It is the law of nature. Otherwise their strength would not hold out. I lay down on the sofa, but I did not sleep. For the 6 weeks of her illness we were looking after her day and night, Lucaria and I together with a trained nurse whom I had engaged from the hospital. I spared no expense. In fact, I was eager to spend money for her. I called in Dr. Schrader and paid him 10 rubles a visit. When she began to get better, I did not show myself so much. But why am I describing it? When she got up again, she sat quietly and silently in my room at a special table, which I had bought for her too about that time. Yes, that's the truth. We were absolutely silent. That is, we began talking afterwards, but only of the daily routine. I purposely avoided expressing myself, but I noticed that she, too, was glad not to have to say a word more than was necessary. It seemed to me that this was perfectly natural on her part. She is too much shattered, too completely conquered, I thought, and I must let her forget and grow used to it. In this way we were silent, but every minute I was preparing myself for the future. I thought that she was too, and it was fearfully interesting to me to guess what she was thinking about to herself then. I will say more. Oh, of course, no one knows what I went through moaning over her in her illness. But I stifled my moans in my own heart, even from Lucaria. I could not imagine, could not even conceive of her dying without knowing the whole truth. When she was out of danger and began to regain her health, I very quickly and completely, I remember, recovered my tranquillity. What is more, I made up my mind to defer our future as long as possible, and meanwhile to leave things just as they were. Yes, something strange and peculiar happened to me then. I cannot call it anything else. I had triumphed, and the mere consciousness of that was enough for me. So the whole winter passed. Oh, I was satisfied as I had never been before, and it lasted the whole winter. You see, there had been a terrible external circumstance in my life which, up till then, that is, up to the catastrophe with my wife, had weighed upon me every day and every hour. I mean the loss of my reputation and my leaving the regiment. In 2 words, I was treated with tyrannical injustice. It is true my comrades did not love me because of my difficult character, and perhaps because of my ridiculous character, though it often happens that what is exalted, precious, and of value to one, for some reason amuses the herd of one's companions. Though I was never liked, not even at school. I was always and everywhere disliked. Even Lucaria cannot like me. What happened in the regiment, though it was the result of their dislike to me, was in a sense accidental. I mention this because nothing is more mortifying and insufferable than to be ruined by an accident, which might have happened or not have happened, from an unfortunate accumulation of circumstances which might have passed over like a cloud. For an intelligent being, it is humiliating. This is what happened. In an interval, at a theatre, I went out to the refreshment bar. A hussar called A came in and began, before all the officers present and the public, loudly talking to 2 other hussars, telling them that Captain Bezumpsev of our regiment was making a disgraceful scene in the passage, and was, he believed, drunk. The conversation did not go further, and indeed it was a mistake, for Captain Bezumpsev was not drunk, and the disgraceful scene was not really disgraceful. The hussars began talking of something else, and the matter ended there. But the next day the story reached our regiment, and then they began saying at once that I was the only officer of our regiment in the refreshment bar at the time, and that when A. the hussar had spoken insolently of Captain Bezumpsev, I had not gone up to A. and stopped him by remonstrating. But on what grounds could I have done so? If he had a grudge against Bezumpsev, it was their personal affair, and why should I interfere? Meanwhile, the officers began to declare that it was not a personal affair, but that it concerned the regiment, and as I was the only officer of the regiment present, I had thereby shown all the officers and other people in the refreshment bar that there could be officers in our regiment who were not over-sensitive on the score of their own honor and the honor of their regiment. I could not agree with this view. They let me know that I could set everything right if I were willing, even now, late as it was, to demand a formal explanation from A. I was not willing to do this, and as I was irritated, I refused with pride. And thereupon I forthwith resigned my commission. That is the whole story. I left the regiment, proud but crushed in spirit. I was depressed in will and mind. Just then it was that my sister's husband in Moscow squandered all our little property, and my portion of it, which was tiny enough, but the loss of it left me homeless, without a farthing. I might have taken a job in a private business, but I did not. After wearing a distinguished uniform, I could not take work in a railway office. And so, if it must be shame, let it be shame. If it must be disgrace, let it be disgrace. If it must be degradation, let it be degradation. The worse it is, the better. That was my choice. Then followed 3 years of gloomy memories, and even Vyazemsky's house. A year and a half ago, my godmother, a wealthy old lady, died in Moscow, and to my surprise left me 3,000 in her will. I thought a little and immediately decided on my course of action. I determined on setting up as a pawnbroker without apologizing to anyone. Money, then a home as far as possible from memories of the past. That was my plan. Nevertheless, the gloomy past and my ruined reputation fretted me every day, every hour. But then I married. Whether it was by chance or not, I don't know. But when I brought her into my home, I thought I was bringing a friend, and I needed a friend so much. But I saw clearly that the friend must be trained, schooled, even conquered. Could I have explained myself straight off to a girl of 16 with her prejudices? How, for instance, could I, without the chance help of the horrible incident of the revolver, have made her believe I was not a coward, and that I had been unjustly accused of cowardice in the regiment? But that terrible incident came just in the nick of time. Standing the test of the revolver, I scored off all my gloomy past. And though no one knew of it, she knew. And for me that was everything, because she was everything for me, all the hope of the future that I cherished in my dreams. She was the one person I had prepared for myself, and I needed no one else. And here she knew everything. She knew, at any rate, that she had been in haste to join my enemies against me unjustly. That thought enchanted me. In her eyes I could not be a scoundrel now, but at most a strange person. And that thought, after all that had happened, was by no means displeasing to me. Strangeness is not a vice. On the contrary, it sometimes attracts the feminine heart. In fact, I purposely deferred the climax. What had happened was, meanwhile, enough for my peace of mind, and provided a great number of pictures and materials for my dreams. That is what's wrong, that I am a dreamer. I had enough material for my dreams, and about her, I thought she could wait. So the whole winter passed in a sort of expectation. I liked looking at her on the sly when she was sitting at her little table. She was busy at her needlework, and sometimes in the evening she read books taken from my bookcase. The choice of books in the bookcase must have had an influence in my favor, too. She hardly ever went out. Just before dusk, after dinner, I used to take her out every day for a walk. We took a constitutional, but we were not absolutely silent as we used to be. I tried, in fact, to make a show of our not being silent, but talking harmoniously. But as I have said already, we both avoided letting ourselves go. I did it purposely. I thought it was essential to give her time. Of course, it was strange that almost till the end of the winter it did not once strike me that, though I loved to watch her stealthily, I had never once, all the winter, caught her glancing at me. I thought it was timidity in her. Besides, she had an air of such timid meekness, such weakness after her illness. Yes, better to wait, and she will come to you all at once of herself. That thought fascinated me beyond all words. I will add one thing. Sometimes, as it were purposely, I worked myself up and brought my mind and spirit to the point of believing she had injured me. And so it went on for some time. But my anger could never be very real or violent. And I felt myself as though it were only acting. and though I had broken off our marriage by buying that bedstead and screen, I could never look upon her as a criminal. And not that I took a frivolous view of her crime, but because I had the sense to forgive her completely, from the very first day, even before I bought the bedstead. In fact, it is strange on my part, for I am strict in moral questions. On the contrary, in my eyes she was so conquered, so humiliated, so crushed, that sometimes I felt agonies of pity for her, though sometimes the thought of her humiliation was actually pleasing to me. The thought of our inequality pleased me. I intentionally performed several acts of kindness that winter. I excused 2 debts. I gave one poor woman money without any pledge. And I said nothing to my wife about it, and I didn't do it in order that she should know. But the woman came herself to thank me almost on her knees, and in that way it became public property. It seemed to me that she heard about the woman with pleasure. But spring was coming. It was mid-April. We took out the double windows, and the sun began lighting up our silent room with its bright beams. But there was, as it were, a veil before my eyes and a blindness over my mind. A fatal, terrible veil. How did it happen that the scales suddenly fell from my eyes, and I suddenly saw and understood? Was it a chance, or had the hour come, or did the ray of sunshine kindle a thought, a conjecture in my dull mind? No, it was not a thought, not a conjecture, but a chord suddenly vibrated. A feeling that had long been dead was stirred and came to life, flooding all my darkened soul and devilish pride with light. It was as though I had suddenly leaped up from my place. And indeed it happened suddenly and abruptly. It happened towards evening, at 5 o'clock, after dinner. Chapter 2. The veil suddenly falls. 2 words first. A month ago I noticed a strange melancholy in her. Not simply silence, but melancholy. That, too, I noticed suddenly. She was sitting at her work, her head bent over her sewing, and she did not see that I was looking at her. And it suddenly struck me that she had grown so delicate-looking, so thin, that her face was pale, her lips were white. All this, together with her melancholy, struck me all at once. I had already heard a little dry cough, especially at night. I got up at once and went off to ask Schrader to come, saying nothing to her. Schrader came next day. She was very much surprised and looked first at Schrader and then at me. "But I am well," she said with an uncertain smile. Schrader did not examine her very carefully. These doctors are sometimes superciliously careless. He only said to me in the other room that it was just the result of her illness, and that it wouldn't be amiss to go for a trip to the sea in the spring, or, if that were impossible, to take a cottage out of town for the summer. In fact, he said nothing except that there was weakness or something of that sort. When Schrader had gone, she said again, looking at me very earnestly, "I am quite well, quite well." But as she said this, she suddenly flushed, apparently from shame. Apparently it was shame. Oh, now I understand. She was ashamed that I was still her husband, that I was looking after her still as though I were a real husband. But at the time I did not understand and put down her blush to humility. The veil. And so, a month later, in April, at 5 o'clock on a bright sunny day, I was sitting in the shop making up my accounts. Suddenly I heard her, sitting in our room at work at her table, begin softly singing. This novelty made an overwhelming impression upon me, and to this day I don't understand it. Till then I had hardly ever heard her sing, unless perhaps in those first days when we were still able to be playful and practice shooting at a target. Then her voice was rather strong, resonant. Though not quite true, it was very sweet and healthy. Now her little song was so faint. It was not that it was melancholy, it was some sort of ballad, but in her voice there was something jangled, broken, as though her voice were not equal to it, as though the song itself were sick. She sang in an undertone, and suddenly, as her voice rose, it broke. Such a poor little voice, it broke so pitifully. She cleared her throat and again began softly singing. My emotions will be ridiculed, but no one will understand why I was so moved. No, I was still not sorry for her. It was still something quite different. At the beginning, for the first minute at any rate, I was filled with sudden perplexity and terrible amazement. A terrible and strange, painful and almost vindictive amazement. She is singing, and in my presence. Has she forgotten about me? Completely overwhelmed, I remained where I was. Then I suddenly got up, took my hat and went out, as it were, without thinking. At least I don't know why or where I was going. Lucaria began giving me my overcoat. "She is singing?" I said to Lucaria involuntarily. She did not understand and looked at me still without understanding, and indeed I was really unintelligible. "Is it the first time she is singing?" "No, she sometimes does sing when you are out," answered Lucaria. I remember everything. I went downstairs, went out into the street and walked along at random. I walked to the corner and began looking into the distance. People were passing by. They pushed against me. I did not feel it. I called a cab and told the man, I don't know why, to drive to Politsevsky Bridge. Then suddenly changed my mind and gave him 20 kopecks. "That's for my having troubled you," I said with a meaningless laugh. But a sort of ecstasy was suddenly shining within me. I returned home, quickening my steps. The poor little jangled, broken note was ringing in my heart again. My breath failed me. The veil was falling from my eyes. Since she sang before me, she had forgotten me. That is what was clear and terrible. My heart felt it. But rapture was glowing in my soul, and it overcame my terror. Oh, the irony of fate! Why, there had been nothing else and could have been nothing else but that rapture in my soul all the winter. But where had I been myself all that winter? Had I been there together with my soul? I ran up the stairs in great haste. I don't know whether I went in timidly. I only remember that the whole floor seemed to be rocking, and I felt as though I were floating on a river. I went into the room. She was sitting in the same place as before, with her head bent over her sewing, but she wasn't singing now. She looked cursorily and without interest at me. It was hardly a look, but just an habitual and indifferent movement upon somebody's coming into the room. I went straight up and sat down beside her in a chair abruptly, as though I were mad. She looked at me quickly, seeming frightened. I took her hand, and I don't remember what I said to her. That is, tried to say, for I could not even speak properly. My voice broke and would not obey me, and I did not know what to say. I could only gasp for breath. "Let us talk. Tell me something." I muttered something stupid. Oh, how could I help being stupid? She started again and drew back in great alarm, looking at my face. But suddenly there was an expression of stern surprise in her eyes. Yes, surprise and stern. She looked at me with wide-open eyes. That sternness, that stern surprise shattered me at once. "So you still expect love? Love?" That surprise seemed to be asking, though she said nothing. But I read it all. Everything within me seemed quivering, and I simply fell down at her feet. Yes, I grovelled at her feet. She jumped up quickly, but I held her forcibly by both hands. And I fully understood my despair. I understood it. But would you believe it? Ecstasy was surging up in my head so violently that I thought I should die. I kissed her feet in delirium and rapture. Yes, in immense, infinite rapture, and that in spite of understanding all the hopelessness of my despair. I wept, said something, but could not speak. Her alarm and amazement were followed by some uneasy misgiving, some grave question, and she looked at me strangely, wildly even. She wanted to understand something quickly, and she smiled. She was horribly ashamed at my kissing her feet, and she drew them back. But I kissed the place on the floor where her foot had rested. She saw it and suddenly began laughing with shame. You know how it is when people laugh with shame. She became hysterical. I saw that her hands trembled. I did not think about that, but went on muttering that I loved her, that I would not get up. "Let me kiss your dress, and worship you like this all my life." I don't know, I don't remember. But suddenly she broke into sobs and trembled all over. A terrible fit of hysterics followed. I had frightened her. I carried her to the bed. When the attack had passed off, sitting on the edge of the bed, with a terribly exhausted look, she took my 2 hands and begged me to calm myself. Come, don't distress yourself. Be calm." And she began crying again. All that evening I did not leave her side. I kept telling her I should take her to Bologna to bathe in the sea now, at once in a fortnight. That she had such a broken voice, I had heard it that afternoon. that I would shut up the shop, that I would sell it to Dobronovov, that everything would begin afresh, and above all, Bologna, Bologna. She listened and was still afraid. She grew more and more afraid. But that was not what mattered most for me. What mattered most to me was the more and more irresistible longing to fall at her feet again, and again to kiss and kiss the spot where her foot had rested, and to worship her, and— "I ask nothing more of you," I kept repeating. "Do not answer me, take no notice of me, only let me watch you from my corner. Treat me as your dog, your thing." She was crying. "I thought that you would leave me like that," suddenly broke from her unconsciously. So unconsciously that, perhaps, she did not notice what she had said. And yet, oh, that was the most significant, momentous phrase she uttered that evening, the easiest for me to understand. And it stabbed my heart as though with a knife. It explained everything to me, everything. But while she was beside me before my eyes, I could not help hoping and was fearfully happy. Oh, I exhausted her fearfully that evening. I understood that, but I kept thinking that I should alter everything directly. At last, towards night, she was utterly exhausted. I persuaded her to go to sleep, and she fell sound asleep at once. I expected her to be delirious. She was a little delirious, but very slightly. I kept getting up every minute in the night and going softly in my slippers to look at her. I wrung my hands over her, looking at that frail creature and that wretched little iron bedstead which I had bought her for 3 roubles. I knelt down, but did not dare to kiss her feet in her sleep, without her consent. I began praying, but leapt up again. Lucaria kept watch over me and came in and out from the kitchen. I went in to her and told her to go to bed, and that tomorrow things would be quite different. And I believed in this, blindly, madly. Oh, I was brimming over with rapture, rapture! I was eager for the next day. Above all, I did not believe that anything could go wrong in spite of the symptoms. Reason had not altogether come back to me, though the veil had fallen from my eyes, and for a long, long time it did not come back. Not till today, not till this very day. Yes, and how could it have come back then? Why, she was still alive then. Why, she was here before my eyes, and I was before her eyes. Tomorrow she will wake up, and I will tell her all this, and she will see it all. That was how I reasoned then, simply and clearly, because I was in an ecstasy. My great idea was the trip to Bologna. I kept thinking for some reason that Bologna would be everything, that there was something final and decisive about Bologna. To Bologna, to Bologna! I waited frantically for the morning. Chapter 3. I understand too well. But you know that was only a few days ago. 5 days, only 5 days ago, last Tuesday. Yes, if there had only been a little longer, if she had only waited a little, and I would have dissipated the darkness. It was not as though she had not recovered her calmness. The very next day she listened to me with a smile in spite of her confusion. All this time, all these 5 days, she was either confused or ashamed. She was afraid, too, very much afraid. I don't dispute it. I am not so mad as to deny it. It was terror, but how could she help being frightened? We had so long been strangers to one another, had grown so alienated from one another, and suddenly all this. But I did not look at her terror. I was dazzled by the new life beginning. It is true, it is undoubtedly true that I made a mistake. There were even, perhaps, many mistakes. When I woke up next day, the first thing in the morning, that was on Wednesday, I made a mistake. I suddenly made her my friend. I was in too great a hurry, but a confession was necessary, inevitable, more than a confession. I did not even hide what I had hidden from myself all my life. I told her straight out that the whole winter I had been doing nothing but brood over the certainty of her love. I made clear to her that my money-lending had been simply the degradation of my will and my mind, my personal idea of self-castigation and self-exaltation. I explained to her that I really had been cowardly that time in the refreshment bar, that it was owing to my temperament, to my self-consciousness. I was impressed by the surroundings, by the theatre. I was doubtful how I should succeed and whether it would be stupid. I was not afraid of a duel, but of its being stupid. And afterwards I would not own it, and tormented everyone, and had tormented her for it, and had married her so as to torment her for it. In fact, for the most part I talked as though in delirium. She herself took my hands and made me leave off. "You are exaggerating. You are distressing yourself." And again there were tears, again almost hysterics. She kept begging me not to say all this, not to recall it. I took no notice of her entreaties, or hardly noticed them. Spring, Bologna. There would be sunshine, there our new sunshine. I kept saying that. I shut up the shop and transferred it to Dobronovov. I suddenly suggested to her giving all our money to the poor except the 3,000 left me by my godmother, which we would spend on going to Bologna. And then we would come back and begin a new life of real work. So we decided, for she said nothing. She only smiled. And I believe she smiled chiefly from delicacy, for fear of disappointing me. I saw, of course, that I was burdensome to her. Don't imagine I was so stupid or egoistic as not to see it. I saw it all to the smallest detail. I saw better than anyone. All the hopelessness of my position stood revealed. I told her everything about myself and about her, and about Lucaria. I told her that I had wept. Oh, of course I changed the conversation. I tried, too, not to say a word more about certain things. And indeed she did revive once or twice. I remember it. Why do you say I looked at her and saw nothing? And if only this had not happened, everything would have come to life again. Why, only the day before yesterday, when we were talking of reading and what she had been reading that winter, she told me something herself, and laughed as she told me, recalling the scene of Gil Blas and the Archbishop of Granada. And with that sweet, childish laughter, just as in old days when we were engaged. One instant! How glad I was! I was awfully struck, though, by the story of the Archbishop. So she had found peace of mind and happiness enough to laugh at that literary masterpiece while she was sitting there in the winter. So then she had begun to be fully at rest, had begun to believe confidently that I should leave her like that. I thought you would leave me like that." Those were the words she uttered then on Tuesday. Oh, the thought of a child of 10! And you know she believed it. She believed that really everything would remain like that. She at her table and I at mine, and we both should go on like that till we were 60. And all at once, I come forward, her husband, and the husband wants love. Oh, the delusion! Oh, my blindness! It was a mistake, too, that I looked at her with rapture. I ought to have controlled myself. As it was, my rapture frightened her. But indeed I did control myself. I did not kiss her feet again. I never made a sign of... well, that I was her husband. Oh, there was no thought of that in my mind. I only worshipped her. But, you know, I couldn't be quite silent. I could not refrain from speaking altogether. I suddenly said to her frankly that I enjoyed her conversation, and that I thought her incomparably more cultured and developed than I. She flushed crimson and said in confusion that I exaggerated. Then, like a fool, I could not resist telling her how delighted I had been when I had stood behind the door listening to her duel, the duel of innocence with that low cad, and how I had enjoyed her cleverness, the brilliance of her wit, and at the same time her childlike simplicity. She seemed to shudder all over, was murmuring again that I exaggerated, but suddenly her whole face darkened. She hid it in her hands and broke into sobs. Then I could not restrain myself. Again I fell at her feet. Again I began kissing her feet. And again it ended in a fit of hysterics, just as on Tuesday. That was yesterday evening, and in the morning... Madman, why, that morning was today, just now, only just now! Listen and try to understand. Why, when we met by the samovar, it was after yesterday's hysterics, I was actually struck by her calmness. That is the actual fact. And all night I had been trembling with terror over what happened yesterday. But suddenly she came up to me and, clasping her hands, this morning, began telling me that she was a criminal, that she knew it, that her crime had been torturing her all the winter, was torturing her now, that she appreciated my generosity. "I will be your faithful wife. I will respect you." Then I leapt up and embraced her like a madman. I kissed her face, kissed her lips like a husband for the first time after a long separation. And why did I go out this morning? Only 2 hours. Our passports for abroad. Oh, God! If only I had come back 5 minutes, only 5 minutes earlier! That crowd at our gates, those eyes all fixed upon me. Oh, God! Lucaria says... Oh, I will not let Lucaria go now for anything. She knows all about it. She has been here all the winter. She will tell me everything. She says that when I had gone out of the house, and only about 20 minutes before I came back, she suddenly went into our room to her mistress to ask her something, I don't remember what, and saw that her icon, that same icon of the Mother of God, had been taken down and was standing before her on the table, and her mistress seemed to have only just been praying before it. "What are you doing, mistress?" "Nothing, Lucaria. Run along." "Wait a minute, Lucaria." She came up and kissed me. "Are you happy, mistress?" I said. "Yes, Lucaria." "Master ought to have come to beg your pardon long ago, mistress. Thank God that you are reconciled." "Very good, Lucaria," she said. "Go away, Lucaria." And she smiled, but so strangely. So strangely that Lucaria went back 10 minutes later to have a look at her. She was standing by the wall, close to the window. She had laid her arm against the wall, and her head was pressed on her arm. She was standing like that, thinking. And she was standing so deep in thought that she did not hear me come and look at her from the other room. She seemed to be smiling, standing, thinking, and smiling. I looked at her, turned softly, and went out, wondering to myself. And suddenly I heard the window open. I went in at once to say, "It's fresh, mistress, mind you don't catch cold." And suddenly I saw she had got on the window and was standing there, her full height in the open window, with her back to me, holding the icon in her hand. My heart sank on the spot. I cried, "Mistress, mistress!" She heard, made a movement to turn back to me, but instead of turning back, took a step forward, pressed the icon to her bosom, and flung herself out of window. I only remember that when I went in at the gate she was still warm. The worst of it was they were all looking at me. At first they shouted, then suddenly they were silent, and then all of them moved away from me, and she was lying there with the icon. I remember, as it were, in the darkness, that I went up to her in silence and looked at her a long while. But all came round me and said something to me. Lucaria was there too, but I did not see her. She says she said something to me. I only remember that workman. He kept shouting to me that only a handful of blood came from her mouth, a handful, and he pointed to the blood on a stone. I believe I touched the blood with my finger. I smeared my finger. I looked at my finger, that I remember, and he kept repeating, "A handful, a handful." "What do you mean by a handful?" I yelled with all my might, I am told, and I lifted up my hands and rushed at him. Oh, wild, wild, incomprehensibility, improbability, impossibility. Chapter 4. I was only 5 minutes too late. Is it not so? Is it likely? Can one really say it was possible? What for? Why did this woman die? Oh, believe me, I understand, but why she died is still a question. She was frightened of my love, asked herself seriously whether to accept it or not, could not bear the question, and preferred to die. I know, no need to rack my brains. She had made too many promises. She was afraid she could not keep them. It is clear. There are circumstances about it quite awful. For why did she die? That is still a question after all. The question hammers at my brain. I would have left her like that if she had wanted to remain like that. She did not believe it, that's what it was. No. No, I am talking nonsense. It was not that at all. It was simply because with me she had to be honest. If she loved me, she would have had to love me altogether, and not as she would have loved the grocer. And as she was too chaste, too pure to consent to such a love as the grocer wanted, she did not want to deceive me. Did not want to deceive me with half-love, counterfeiting love, or a quarter love. They are honest, too honest, that is what it is. I wanted to instill breadth of heart in her in those days, do you remember? A strange idea. It is awfully interesting to know. Did she respect me or not? I don't know whether she despised me or not. I don't believe she did despise me. It is awfully strange. Why did it never once enter my head all the winter that she despised me? I was absolutely convinced of the contrary up to that moment when she looked at me with stern surprise. Stern it was. I understood on the spot that she despised me. I understood once for all, forever. Let her despise me all her life even, only let her be living. Only yesterday she was walking about, talking. I simply can't understand how she threw herself out of window. And how could I have imagined it 5 minutes before? I have called Lucaria. I won't let Lucaria go now for anything. Oh, we might still have understood each other. We had simply become terribly estranged from one another during the winter. But couldn't we have grown used to each other again? Why couldn't we have come together again and begun a new life again? I am generous. She was too. That was a point in common. Only a few more words, another 2 days, no more, and she would have understood everything. What is most mortifying of all is that it is chance. Simply a barbarous, lagging chance. That is what is mortifying. 5 minutes, only 5 minutes too late. Had I come 5 minutes earlier, the moment would have passed away like a cloud, and it would never have entered her head again. And it would have ended by her understanding it all. But now again empty rooms and me alone. Here the pendulum is ticking. It does not care, it has no pity. There is no one. That's the misery of it. I keep walking and walking. I know, you need not tell me. It amuses you. You think it ridiculous that I complain of chance in those 5 minutes. But it is evident. Consider one thing. She did not even leave a note to say, "Blame no one for my death," as people always do. Might she not have thought that Lucaria might get into trouble? "She was alone with her," might have been said, "and pushed her out." In any case, she would have been taken up by the police, if it had not happened that 4 people, from the windows, from the lodge, and from the yard, had seen her stand with the icon in her hands, then jump out of herself. But that too was a chance, that the people were standing there and saw her. No, it was all a moment, only an irresponsible moment, a sudden impulse, a fantasy. What if she did pray before the icon? It does not follow that she was facing death. The whole impulse lasted perhaps only some 10 minutes. It was all decided perhaps while she stood against the wall with her head on her arm, smiling. The idea darted into her brain. She turned giddy and... and could not resist it. Say what you will, it was clearly misunderstanding. It could have been possible to live with me. And what if it were anemia? Was it simply from poorness of blood, from the flagging of vital energy? She had grown tired during the winter, that was what it was. I was too late. How thin she is in her coffin. How sharp her nose is grown. Her eyelashes lie straight as arrows. And you know, when she fell, nothing was crushed, nothing was broken. Nothing but that handful of blood. A teaspoonful, that is, from internal injury. The strange thought. If only it were possible not to bury her. For if they take her away, then... Oh, no, it is almost incredible that they should take her away. I am not mad, and I am not raving. On the contrary, my mind was never so lucid. But what shall I do when again there is no one? Only the 2 rooms and me alone with the pledges. Madness, madness, madness! I worried her to death, that is what it is. What are your laws to me now? What do I care for your customs, your morals, your life, your state, your faith? Let your judge judge me. Let me be brought before your court. Let me be tried by jury, and I shall say that I admit nothing. The judge will shout, "Be silent, officer." And I will shout to him, "What power have you now that I will obey? Why did blind, inert force destroy that which was dearest of all? What are your laws to me now? They are nothing to me. Oh, I don't care." She was blind, blind. She is dead, she does not hear. You do not know with what paradise I would have surrounded you. There was paradise in my soul, I would have made it blossom around you. Well, you wouldn't have loved me, so be it, what of it? Things should still have been like that, everything should have remained like that. You should only have talked to me as a friend. We could have rejoiced and laughed with joy, looking at one another. And so we should have lived. And if you had loved another, well, so be it, so be it. You should have walked with him laughing, and I should have watched you from the other side of the street. Oh, anything, if only she would open her eyes just once. For one instant, only one. If she would look at me as she did this morning when she stood before me and made a vow to be a faithful wife. Oh, in one look she would have understood it all. Oh, blind force! Oh, nature! Men are alone on earth, that is what is dreadful. "Is there a man alive on the battlefield?" cries the Russian hero. I cry the same, though I am not a hero, and no one answers my cry. They say the sun gives life to the universe. The sun is rising, and look at it, is it not dead? Everything is dead, and everywhere there are dead. Men are alone. Around them is silence. That is the earth. Men love one another. Who said that? Whose commandment is that? The pendulum ticks carelessly, heartlessly. 2:00 at night. Her little shoes are standing by the little bed as though waiting for her. No, seriously. When they take her away tomorrow, what will become of me? This concludes The Meek One. What follow are some comments on the story. In my view, the core theme of the story can be captured by two literary quotes that bookend the narration. In the first chapter, we discover that the pawnbroker has a detailed grip on the work of the German Romantic poet Goethe, quoting the words of the demon Mephistopheles as they appear in Faust. The quote itself is of interest. It introduces the demon as a figure who seeks to do ill but does good. And so the pawnbroker introduces himself to his newly beloved as a man of conflicted intentions. And even as he remembers the episode, he remembers it as having done something chic. In the final paragraph, in his despair, he vaguely recalls a different quotation. Quote, "Men love one another. Who said that? Whose commandment is that?" Unquote. The answer, of course, is that Jesus gave that commandment, for instance in the Gospel of John, chapter 15, verse 12. What kind of man is it that has thorough knowledge of the demons of Romanticism, but only a darkened notion of the Gospels? Then, in the background, there is another pair of bookends, non-verbal, seen but not heard. That is the religious icon which, in the story's beginning, the Meek One brings to the pawnbroker's shop, and which she then clutches to her chest when she makes her final exit from it. So we have two principal characters, and two sets of thematic images to develop. It is unsurprising that one set is verbal and the other is non-verbal. One of these characters is extraordinarily talkative, the other is mostly silent. Yet, as Chloe Papadopoulos has recently observed, for all the prolixity of the husband, the movement of the plot is not about words, but about their absence. The Meek One begins their betrothal with the cheerful chatter of feminine youth, before the pawnbroker cloaks their relationship in an oppressive silence. Why should he do this? In fact, as the story unfolds, we might be astonished by how completely the man squanders his good marital fortune. Despite his past difficulties, despite the perceived disgrace of his profession, he has financial stability and a young consort who begins their romantic association as a cheerful, virtuous, willing would-be lover. How could he possibly destroy all this so swiftly and totally? The answer is that the narrator, like the underground man before him, is a disaffected romantic. Although this feature is developed throughout, the best synopsis of his motivation is provided in Part 1, Chapter 4, entitled Plans and Plans. One of these plans was his decision to become a pawnbroker, as a sort of retaliation against a world that had so cruelly disrespected him earlier. When the Meek One sarcastically suggests in the opening chapter that he is revenging himself against society, she is surprisingly close to the mark. After having nursed his injury from his discharge from the regiment, proudly turning down the opportunity for humble work and spending a year in degradation in the Haymarket, he deliberately opens shop in a disreputable business in a kind of defiance, expecting to retire with his noble but misunderstood ideals to the Caucasus. In all this he is putting on the airs of the romantic hero, rather like the young Werther of another of Goethe's works. There is a thin line between romanticism and egoism, something that Dostoevsky first explores in detail in The Insulted and Injured, and then later in Notes. And the pawnbroker, like the underground man, has crossed that line. And so we see it again in the other of his plans, his effort to shape and mold his wife into a person who could come of her own volition to discover the depth of his suffering and his nobility of feeling. The romantic hero does not come out to plead for his own heroism directly. He needs his audience to recognize it herself. And at any rate, she is too young fully to understand him through words, as the idealism of youth doesn't understand real suffering. So he must suffer in silence until she can understand and love him fully. The episode with the revolver is thus interpreted by him as a great conquest, as one more proof of his nobility and courage to his wife, which will make her future surrender to him that much sweeter, even as he unwittingly ruptures the bond between them irrevocably. Indeed, even after the veil falls in Part 2 and he realizes that he has fully lost his wife's attention, he still continues dreaming of some great reconciliation and renewed love in Bologna. Nevertheless, the man does make his way toward the truth, and much of the genius of the story concerns the pawnbroker's tortuous path toward discovery. The man does not lack for candor in his testimony. The problem is that the man himself is conflicted, mired in self-contradiction, denial, and projection. The pattern of saying one thing and then contradicting it a moment later becomes so deeply embedded into the narration that it becomes natural to our ears, even as it continues to the story's final pages. Was he really only 5 minutes too late in such a way that his wife would have swiftly come to her senses if he had returned home earlier? Was it really just a case of anemia or a passing weakness? He asserts that it was, but he also concedes the opposite, that he worried her to death, that she knew she could not receive his love in the way he wanted. And we know, despite the contradiction, that the man has discovered the truth. That is the method throughout. So he claims that he knew all along that his wife would remain faithful in that interview with Efimovitch. Nevertheless, he concedes that he brought the revolver. Later, he rearranges the furniture to evict his wife from his bed. She was conquered but not forgiven, he says. Several chapters later, he insists that he had really forgiven her from the very first moment, and at no point held a grudge. Contradictions abound, yet somehow we know what to believe. In this latter case of the bed, the pawnbroker is playing at his game of speaking without words. He believes himself to be very skilled at this procedure, and tells us as much, and thinks that somehow as a result his wife will recognize in him the noble but internally wounded hero. In fact, the move backfires, and what he thinks he does in the service of some future outbreak of love and adoration winds up killing it entirely. The pawnbroker thus discovers that he has gotten 2 things wrong. He has misunderstood his wife, and he has misunderstood what kind of love is worth pursuing. He thinks of the Meek One as a character in a romantic novel. Indeed, he engages in at least one obvious form of projection. He imagines that when she hesitated at the moment of his proposal, she may have been tempted to choose the worst option, as a kind of defiance of her fate. Of course, she almost certainly thought nothing of the sort. That kind of attitude is what motivated the pawnbroker himself to pursue life in the Haymarket in the wake of his discharge from the regiment, as he informs us in Part 2, Chapter 1. It is the pawnbroker, not the Meek One, who was governed by romantic pique. Nor is she likely to serve the role that he imagined during his self-absorbed dreaming. His plan is to retire to the Caucasus with a young, beautiful, devoted wife, and thus the Meek One is thought of as a kind of ornament that marks his own conquest. He delights in the inequality of their ages and social position. But does he love her? This question is clearly a sore spot for him, as more than once he angrily protests against imagined interlocutors who press him on this issue. In fact, I think he does love her. But the depth of love is revealed only as the story proceeds. In the beginning, the Meek One seems almost like a tool to serve the man's ego and his various plans. He does admire her. He revels in her wit, in her skillful discomfiting of Efimovitch, in her virtue, and so on. But he nevertheless tyrannizes over her in the Pygmalion role, trying to mold her to fit his designs. But by the last chapter, all that is gone. Quite apart from the role of hero, he would be happy to be a cuckold admiring her from a distance, if only she were alive and happy. So, as is typical with Dostoevsky, we have the conflict between the will of the ego and the duty to love. The pawnbroker discovers that duty too late, as he fumbles in the last paragraph toward the fundamental commandment of the Gospels. And who exactly is the object of his love? The pawnbroker himself scarcely knew her for most of their marriage, so we can only take educated guesses ourselves. She is a representative of something of a trope in the Dostoevsky canon, much like Lisa from Notes from Underground, or Sonia from Crime and Punishment, or perhaps Nastenka from White Nights. Good, idealistic, loving, but cast into difficult circumstances and capable of great suffering. While other iterations of the Garnett translation will have her described as a gentle creature, the Barnes & Noble version, which we have been using, is very deliberate about using the term meek throughout, connecting her to the beatitude of Matthew 5:5, and thus to a kind of moral ideal. Nevertheless, she is not a shrinking violet. Lucaria describes her as proud. She works to get out from under the oppression of her aunts. She refuses to sell herself too short in her advertisements for work. She does not jump slavishly at the offer of marriage. She rebels against the pawnbroker. She rebuffs the advances of Efimovitch. She is capable of delivering a stern look. And she raises the loaded revolver to the pawnbroker's forehead. The narrator takes her lowering of the pistol as a defeat, as though he has conquered her. I am not so sure, and we may interpret it the other way around. The standoff here recalls the altercation between Dunya and Svidrigailov in Crime and Punishment. And in that prior story, when Dunya lowers the pistol, she defeats her opponent. Perhaps the same can be seen here. The wife lowers the pistol because she is meek, where meekness is a virtue, a sort of inverse correlate of the egoism of the pawnbroker. The Meek One can recognize the dignity and worth of others, over and above her own designs and ambitions, and so does not pull the trigger. For all her youthful naivete, the Meek One is capable of real love right off the bat. The pawnbroker is too wrapped up in his own plans for that. And so he kills her twice over. First by stifling her love, and then by trying to force love into what he has already killed. Contra the pawnbroker's occasional assertions, the leap from the window is quite deliberate. as she knows that she cannot be what her husband wants. The Beatitude says that the meek shall inherit the earth. What exactly does this meek one inherit? The best answer I can offer is to gesture toward the religious icon that she clutches to her breast, an icon that represents the very commandment that the pawnbroker so belatedly discovers. It comes into his shop in the narrative's beginning, but could not really be received there, and so it leaves the shop at the climax. Whether the meek one has her eternal inheritance elsewhere is not addressed in the story, but those familiar with the author will anticipate his answer. And what awaits the pawnbroker? In the story's last sentence, he asks what will become of him. What answer can we give? The despair is so acute in the final pages that it seems almost inappropriate to attempt to find any hope at all. But there is one point of contrast between the pawnbroker and the underground man before him that might offer a very narrow silver lining. The underground man finishes his notes as the same miserable human being who began them. That is not the case with the pawnbroker. If it is true that everything is purified by suffering, as Dostoevsky often tells us, then the pawnbroker has suffered in the right kind of way. Whether he will come to show Christ's love is not something the text asks us to consider, but perhaps we may have hope yet. Or so it seems to me. But this very rich short story naturally has inspired a great deal of discussion among its admirers. So, if you find these remarks to be inaccurate or incomplete, I invite you to improve upon them in the comments section below. I thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the experience.